welcome to another episode of Test, Optimize, and Scale. Very excited, privileged at that, to have Balky Nair with us here today, President and CEO of Oscilla Power, a top campaign in the equity crowdfunding Reg CF space. We're going to talk about Oscilla Power's revolutionary technology, the raise, everything going on with the company. Balky, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
Excellent. We've had the pleasure of working with you and seeing your campaign evolve, seeing the company with all types of new updates. We're just talking about some of the developments this week. I want to get into those, but figured we'd start with you. Could we talk a bit about your background, your history, everything you did leading into the development of Oscilla Power?
Sure. Just prior to founding Oscilla Power, I have been involved in the clean tech space for about 20 years now. I have an engineering background. I've done an MBA along the way, so a combination of engineering and finance is sort of my background. And then from there, I previously headed another clean tech related company. It was a sensor company based in Salt Lake City called Emissense. I had a chance to exit from there back in 2008. I was sort of thinking about what to do next, and renewable energy really was exciting to me, and looked around to see what type of technologies or what type of spaces I wanted to play in, and this particular area of ocean energy rose to the top. So that's what I've been doing for the last decade or so, is filling that gap of technology in this very attractive space, trying to make it real.
Absolutely. And like you said, with your experience, education, moving into projects that you eventually saw exits from, you really had the opportunity to focus on where you want to put your energy and to develop new technologies around energy at that. What pointed you towards Oscilla Power's tech? What gave you the idea, and maybe you could give an overview of Oscilla Power as well too, but when did the light bulb begin turning on there?
Yeah, so my co-founder and I brainstormed around opportunity. So we did not start with technology. We started with opportunity. So it was about where in the renewable energy space can we make an impact? And that starts by looking at where the gaps in renewable technologies were. So remember, this is back about a decade ago, and solar and wind were just about taking off at that time. So what we were looking for was, where are the gaps still present? So it still exists, but at the time it was an even bigger gap. That if you look at renewables in general, the issue is all about supply and demand. So if you simply look at solar and wind, those by themselves are not enough to fill the gap that's needed as demand for electricity increases worldwide. So if you project for the next 30 years or so, what will happen in current scenarios is that solar and wind will grow like gangbusters. They do extremely well. But even with that level of growth, we'll actually have to burn more fossil fuels over the next 30 years than what we are doing today, simply to keep up with demand. So there really was no other solution in our mind other than to add additional renewable resources to the mix so that we can start cutting the amount of fossil fuel usage. So we looked around to see where else opportunity lay, and ocean wave energy quickly rose up to the top because it's this wonderful resource with significant quantities of available energy. If you look at the total amount of incident energy all over the world's coastlines in terms of ocean waves, it's about 2 terawatts. To put that number in context, that's about 15% of global electricity demand. And we have barely produced maybe 10 megawatts of that energy simply because we just don't have good enough technology, or did not have good enough technology at that time to be able to tap that energy effectively. So we clearly saw a big technology gap that could untap a major opportunity, and that's where we chose to put our energies at that time.
Love how you focused on the opportunity first, then built the tech around it. As you said, you saw what was currently being done, percentages of the current energy that can be produced from these new methods. What was being done when Oscilla Power was first formed in terms of wave technology towards energy? Was this a space that was already pioneered, or were you guys at the forefront? And at what stages were you able to add these developments that are really disrupting things in your space at the moment?
Yeah, certainly not the first people to venture into ocean energy or wave energy. The oldest patents for wave energy, incredibly, are about 200 years old at this point.
Wow.
So people have been thinking, people knew there were a lot of energy in the waves for a long time. And because it was so attractive, there have been many, many efforts. The problem has been it's not quite as simple to tap that energy as it is, say, to tap wind. In the case of wind, it's sort of flow in one direction. You can put a turbine in there and turn it and produce electricity. Waves go up and down. And literally every single wave that crosses a point is slightly different. So to come up with the right technology to do that efficiently and cost effectively has constantly been a challenge in this space. So when we came in, there were a few big companies, and you can look them up. There are a couple of public companies in this space as well. And they had raised some money, and they were trying to deploy their big devices. The problem was the technology that's needed to tap energy efficiently from waves required a combination of software and hardware capabilities that were just starting to mature at the time that we came along. It really requires a lot of intensive numerical modeling to be able to predict how these devices interact with the waves and capture that energy. And in a sense, a lot of the people who came before us were playing blind. And they simply had to build their devices with their best guesses on how they would operate, because that numerical capability did not exist at that time. You need supercomputers, you need really efficient software to be able to use. And today, we can do more on a standard desktop than what was possible for a whole huge team maybe 15, 20 years ago. And that gap meant that a lot of capital went into building big devices. You can look up a few companies around the world, Pelamis, Aquamarine, etc. They built big devices. But both from a performance standpoint as well as a reliability standpoint, there were big problems that started to crop up. So a number of those companies have now gone away. But what also happened was the capability that I talked about in terms of that software and hardware mix that was needed to model these did come up. And it's not just us, but the industry as a whole has started to tap into it. And now there are sort of 3 or 4 competitors around the world with good enough technology to start to capture this finally. It's been a long effort to get to the point that we're at, but we do believe that the technologies and the sort of combination of demand and technology is the right point where this market is just about ready to explode at this point.
Sure. And what is the technology? How do you get it to work? As you mentioned, there's a lot of challenges. People have been trying to do it for some time. Didn't realize it went back 200 years. And we're just now getting to the point where, softwares, where operating power, or where, the entire grid is ready for this. How does your technology operate for any audiences that may have not been to your offering page yet?
Yeah. The simplest way to think about it is, so I don't know if you remember sort of your high school classes with a tuning fork. So if you tap a tuning fork, it resonates and it creates that vibrational noise because it's in resonance. So the simple principle is we try to get our wave energy devices to be in resonance with the waves. And that means that you're absorbing energy from the waves. Now, the trick, like I said earlier, is that every single wave is slightly different. So we have to design a system that can actually respond to all of those waves as much as possible. So that translates to ultimately, how do you capture energy? You got to get something to move, right? If it's a wind turbine, you got to get the blades to rotate. In our device, the natural motion of waves, if you look at them, is an up and down motion. So we need our systems to move up and down as much as possible. But that's not the only type of motion that's possible. If you just kind of imagine a float that's on the surface, it could move up and down. That's called the heave motion. It could move front to back. That's called the surge motion. It could move around in place, and that's called pitch and roll motion. So what we have done is we've come up with a technology where our device can move in many ways, and also it moves differently in different types of waves. So like I said, every wave is a little different. So if you get a wave that's small, has a what we refer to as a period is effectively the time it takes for a wavefront to cross and for get over until the next wavefront comes along. That is called the natural period. So typically in weak waves, that natural period is about 6 seconds or so. So if you sit at a spot and count the waves, about every 6 seconds, so you get a peak. In very strong waves, that period gets larger, about double that, maybe 12 seconds. It takes longer for it to come through. So under each of those conditions, we design our system to move slightly differently. So under very weak waves, we get a lot of that pitch and roll motion that we talked about. Under the most prevalent conditions, which is about 9 seconds or so, we get a lot of heave motion, which is up and down motion. And then at the very strong waves, like 12-second periods, we get a lot of the front to back motion or the surge motion. And what that means effectively is that we have a wideband capture device. It's been the major gap in this space, where people for a long time used to come with big devices that have large nameplate capacity. They'll call it a megawatt device. But if you really look at how much electricity those devices were producing, when you average it out over the year, it would be a tiny fraction of that. In the energy space, we refer to it as a capacity factor. It's sort of the actual amount of average electricity that you produce over the nameplate capacity. So a typical wind turbine has a nameplate capacity, say, megawatt and a half, and will have a 25% capacity factor, which means that averaged over the year, it produces about 25% of a megawatt and a half times 24 hours times 365 hours. That's the amount of electricity it can produce. So our previous devices had capacity factors that were so low, it might just have been a few percent. It was 2 or 3% for these previous generation devices that I talked about. Simply not cost competitive. They simply were not producing enough electricity to make that capital cost justifiable. We have developed a technology that now is maybe 5 to 10 times greater than that, depending on the location. So we are approaching capacity factors typical of conventional wind turbines or solar farms. So all of a sudden, it becomes far more economically viable, and that's sort of the approach. And the way we did that was by developing the technology using sophisticated numerical modeling techniques, both internally as well as working with other university groups, national labs, etc. And now we feel like we are sort of narrowing down to a point where it's an optimized device that can compete head-to-head with other renewable resources around the world.
Outstanding. And how is the community in this industry? When you're talking about university groups, when you're talking about other companies in the space, other experts, consultants, advisors, is it a collective? Is it, different experts supporting one another? Is there some type of competition? And how has Ocelot Power been embraced into those discussions?
Yeah, it certainly is all of the above in a sense. There are a couple of, it is led largely by, I'd say, small companies. There was a time when the bigger companies tried to play in the space a little bit, but they've now taken a bit of a backseat. So it is startups like us that are really driving the space right now. It's supported by an extended network of a number of universities and national labs. If you look at Sandia National Lab, NREL, Pacific Northwest National Lab, universities like Oregon State University, University of Maine, outside the U.S., University of Edinburgh, plenty of sort of locations where technology is being developed and our capability is being developed. There are some common use software tools that have been developed by the national labs that are available for any developer to use. And they do offer significant support in federally funded programs as well. So typically when the Department of Energy comes out with a FOA, they, in parallel, fund the labs to support these development teams and contribute additional effort to these programs. So yes, it's a community that's supporting it, but it's driven largely by small, aggressive teams like ours and companies like ours at this point.
Sure. Now, is wave energy something that you can picture on a global level? Is it going to be compartmentalized to different regions? What percentage of energy grids, could wave energy take up in the future? Of course, don't want to ask any questions that are forward-looking statements or anything along those lines, but just trying to understand the context of wave energy and the overall capabilities.
Yeah. It's as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of incident energy around the world. We estimate that about 500 gigawatts of that is tappable, roughly. And to put that number in context, 500 gigawatts is approximately equal to the total amount of installed solar or wind through about 20 years or so. Right from the beginning when solar and wind were starting to get installed, for about 20 years or so, each of those resources were about 500 gigawatts, give or take 100 gigawatts. So that's the extent of the opportunity. It's not as large as either of those resources. Still a very, very significant resource that can result in a big thing. The beauty is that it almost perfectly complements solar in many parts of the world. So it's not going to necessarily need to compete head-to-head with solar, but you can think about solar and wave installations together starting to get a larger extent of sort of meeting the needs of electricity around the world. I'll give you a couple of examples. On the US West Coast, wave energy tends to peak in the winter. It's substantially higher than the resource in the summer. That's when there's a lot of cloud cover in the coastal regions, and you don't have as much solar. So it tends to complement that. And on the other end of the world, in India, it's during the monsoon season when there's a lot of cloud cover and you don't have enough solar, that wave energy tends to peak. So it tends to complement solar both on that seasonal cycle as well as a daily cycle. If you think about one of the main gaps in solar, is that the sun only shines in the middle of the day when the demand is not that high. But once it gets to the evenings, the sun goes down. So you got to find some way to store that electricity and then supply it to the grid. The beauty is that wave energy tends to peak in the evenings in many parts of the world. So it complements solar. So a project developer who wants to offer renewable energy as a commodity and installs both solar and wave can start to meet that demand without having to install tons of storage. So there's real value there that can be tapped without necessarily having to compete head-to-head with other renewables. As far as the resource, as a thumb rule, wave energy tends to be higher away from the equator, tends to be higher on the west coast of continents. So if you look at the U.S., the best locations are Northern California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Hawaii, and so on. If you look at Europe, it's Western Europe, and so on. In Australia, South Africa, Chile, there are a few hotspots for wave energy around the world. But beyond that, if you kind of look at niche areas, some of the smaller devices can serve island communities. If you look at, say, the Fiji Islands or some locations in the Caribbean, they produce all their electricity by burning diesel that's brought by ship. So while we pay maybe 5 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity on the mainland, they might pay $1 per kilowatt hour out there. And if you install one of our devices, those are going to be small devices. They won't be cheap, but it will still be cheaper than what they're paying today. So you might be able to produce your electricity for 50 cents per kilowatt hour compared to $1 that they're paying right now. So there are some additional niche opportunities which could result in early adoption even over those larger markets.
It makes perfect sense, and continues to paint the opportunity here. You have the upfront for the installation for each location, but the revenue model is fairly straightforward from there, selling power to the grid. So once you're up and running, it becomes a pretty clear projection of what's possible for the organization.
Yes. I'll clarify that our business model is going to be an equipment sales model. So we fully realize that we'll probably have to do a couple of early projects and sell electricity just to prove out the technology and show that we are viable and all that. But beyond that, the niche that we hope to fill in this space is more like what a wind turbine manufacturer does in the wind turbine market. So think about a Siemens or a GE or a Vestas selling wind turbines to project developers. That's the role that Ocelot ultimately hopes to fill. But in order to get to that point, we'll have to prove out, and so we'll do a few early projects until then.
Sure, absolutely. Part of the path ahead. And I want to speak with you about equity crowdfunding a little bit. How did you first learn about Reg CF? Why were you attracted to this vehicle for financing and for bringing on a crowd, marketing, bringing on awareness? What first led you to regulation crowdfunding?
We had some board advisors that had some experience with it previously, and that's who pointed it. We heard that some of the other, I mentioned that we have a couple of legitimate competitors around the world in Europe and so on. We noticed that they had some success in this space in Europe, and that got us to think about it. And when we logically thought about it, renewable energy is very attractive, to people at large. And while sort of institutional funding, especially for early stage clean tech, is harder to attract. You kind of need to get to a certain stage where you have big devices deployed before you can attract significant funding into this space. It has sort of a mass appeal, and for very real reasons. And for that reason, we decided to go after it and try it out, and did our first round with Microventures, which turned out quite well.
And, from what you were told about equity crowdfunding and then going through the actual process yourself, from everything on the administrative side, legal, finance, working with the portal, everything across the board with the SEC, FINRA, to get set up, to the actual activation and starting to bring people to your offering page, what have you learned that you wish you knew coming right out of the gate? What different changes have occurred from what you expected going in to what you actually experienced?
I think what I would say is, honestly, there weren't that many surprises. We did a good job of communicating with the portal and so on to ask the right questions up ahead. I think it's not necessarily something that we learned the hard way, but it's something that I would strongly recommend to people, is to kind of ask a lot of questions early on, like build up hypothetical scenarios, have a very good legal team backing you who can help you with those questions to ask at that point. So asking those questions kind of helped us minimize the amount of surprises that we'd get down the line. There are costs associated with this. It's a very good idea to get a handle on those costs by asking the right questions. You and I had this conversation also in terms of how much advertising could go into it. And, at a very high level, you would think that's a very small number relative to the amount that you raise. It's not necessarily so. But then it's a mental thing of adjusting to that to say, yeah, that is the marketing that you need to do. And it's, so long as you can raise the amount that you're targeting by investing that money, it is a worthwhile investment, and sort of getting your mind wrapped around that. Even though what you end up spending is a high amount, it still turns out to be at least not a surprise at that point.
Absolutely. And for any audience members that aren't aware, Balky, Ocelot Power have one of the top microventure campaigns and are now live on Start Engine as well. Outstanding in comparison to other issuers who have raised, who have marketed on these portals across the entire industry as a whole. What do you think have been the big differentiators? What would have been some of the key drivers towards bringing on the high volume of investors that you have got to participate to date?
Yeah, I would say positive news throughout the campaign, really. So when you hit your milestones on your programs, communicate that effectively during the race. And so long as you are actually making progress, and you're peppering the round and the marketing around the round with real achievements that is happening as you're making progress, I think investors recognize that. It's the kind of people who look at this type of investment are usually people who are successful in their own right, and they know what to look for and what kind of companies might be successful. So they thrive on success, and you have to communicate your success as it happens as well, but also to be honest during that process as well. If there are issues and people ask those questions, it's a matter of being candid and honest about that as well. So I think it's all about communication and sharing your success and wanting people to share in that success.
That's very consistent with our experience working with you as well, Balky. My content team has pointed out so many times your commitment to communicating to prospective investors, being able to highlight different points on your technology, milestones of the raise. We've seen it as a common factor on successful campaigns. The most active founders have the most successful campaigns. So both yourself and your team as well too. Has it been more work than you anticipated, participating in articles, webinars, portal updates, everything about getting that message out there about the momentum that you're seeing?
Yeah, that's another one of those sort of mental adjustment things that you realize that you have to do, but it is a very worthwhile thing to do. Essentially, is that it does take a little bit more than what you originally anticipate, but you realize at the end of it that it's a very worthwhile thing to do. And it's one of those things where if you put in that effort, it tends to pay back, and it's very rewarding when it does. So yes, it did take a little bit more than what we anticipated in terms of our time and commitment going into it. But the net result, we achieved our goal of what we were trying to raise to meet an immediate goal, and it paid us back in full.
Excellent. And for any founders listening in, you're giving a lot of great recommendations here, but anything specifically that you would point out to say, hey, definitely test this out, whether it's an element of an offering page, a piece of advertising, an advertising channel as a whole, a type of content, a portal update, anything, whether it's on the structuring or the marketing side that you would definitely recommend a founder, or maybe outside of equity crowdfunding, just as an entrepreneur growing their company as a whole, any type of growth strategy or marketing technique that you would recommend testing out?
I'd say think big is one part. You may not get exactly where you want to get, but I have a personal saying, which is if you aim for the sky, you'll at least reach the treetops. So, think big, think more than what you want to raise. You may not get all the way there, but you'll get enough in the process of doing that. When you aim big, you kind of set yourself realistic amounts of time commitments and spending and so on that is needed to kind of get to that point as well. I'd say surround yourself with good people. In our case, we used you all for the marketing. So do an honest assessment of what your skills are and what your company's core capabilities are, and what's lacking, bring it in from the outside in as part of this campaign. Because if you try to do everything yourself, it may not necessarily be quite as attractive to people. People may not find you, people may not like the messages that you're putting out, or it may not resonate with them. And sort of small, subtle things make a difference. So usually if you find expertise that you can bring into your team to kind of supplement what you have internally, it usually pays off.
Think big, build a team around you, and just continue working towards it in that regard. What about in terms of optimizing? What if something doesn't work right out of the gate, or if it's performing marginally, but you want to be able to get it to the next stages. You want to be able to really have it operate at scale, like you said, to get as close to kind of what you actually need. Any insights in terms to how to optimize?
Yeah, in our personal experience, we did a fair bit of that, where we looked at the audiences that our message was resonating with, and then trying to hone in the message further to those audiences. And nowadays there are plenty of good tools available where a marketing agency can look and see which ads are working and what is leading to investments and what is not working so well. So then in your next go around, you can try to focus your ads, focus your messages to the group where it's working with, the audience that it's resonating with, so that you get sort of better and better as you go along in the campaign. And sometimes it's hard to predict that ahead of time. Sometimes sort of what we expect is not necessarily what pans out. Like, ours is a renewable energy company. We'd have kind of expected that our message would resonate in certain regions of the country and so on. It was kind of a broad-based message. If I look at sort of the number of investors who put money in, they came in from all across the country, all across the world, really, and we couldn't really pinpoint it. It was more based on a sort of target, let's say, mindset and personality, more so than a region or a geography. So, you get surprised in the process of this, and just follow the data is what I would suggest, and that helps you optimize it best as you go along.
Couldn't agree more. Follow the data. Look at the numbers to show you what's working or not working. And then once it is, have those resources to be able to scale, be able to say, looking at the analytics, here's what's working best. Let's ramp up that. How has the process been for you scaling? What has that experience been like? What type of tips or examples can you discuss in terms of how founders, anyone listening in, could scale?
You're talking about scaling the company up as a whole, right? In terms of using the raise to scale the company up, essentially.
Yes, it could be scaling the marketing for the equity crowdfunding as well, but I think everyone's most interested, even if it's starting with that, in terms of overall company growth, overall scale.
Yeah. So as far as the campaign itself, what I would say is think about what you can do with different amounts raised, right? So you kind of have to plan that up ahead of time because your investors look at that. So, really kind of seriously think about what if you raise only your minimum, right? How are you going to spend that money? And then, build up realistic milestones from there on up in terms of what can be achieved. The more vague you are, the harder it is for an investor to kind of get their head around why they should put more money into your company. And the more clear you are in terms of what you can use that money for, I think the better the message resonates. So in our case, the particular example was we needed a certain amount of money to complete the construction of our first commercial scale prototype. That type of messaging that says, if we get to this amount, that helps us complete this system, and then showing them, models or designs and visuals of what that product can be, helps them, helps that investment become very real to them. And ultimately, we were able to bring our big investors in, who put in significant amounts of funding, 25K and higher, and show them the device that they helped to build. And their name went on a plaque that's actually on our device, essentially. So it's a very real thing that they helped to create. And that type of messaging worked incredibly well for us in terms of getting, from small numbers to large numbers on the raise.
Mm-hmm. Physically bringing your investors into the organization. I mean, literally a plaque, on the platform there. Because, back to building team, that's really what you're doing here, bringing on all of these shareholders to be able to be part of your growth, bring strategic partners together, bring in investors who are going to share with their friends and family to potentially invest as well, and continue to use them towards growth.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then other part that really worked for us was communication with the investor group itself. So once you get to a certain point, you kind of know who the people who have put early money into your company is. And many of them came back and repeated their investment. So to get up to that large amount, a significant portion of that was actually repeat investment. So you literally could kind of see that every time we had some significant accomplishments and reach out to those groups, that we would see spikes in the amount of investment that came in. So they want to be part of this. They see a successful company. They'd rather put more money into it so they can get a bigger share of your organization than try to research a whole new organization. So sort of repeat marketing to the same investor group is another thing that ultimately helped us quite a bit in that raise.
Yeah, we're typically seeing 10% to 30% of investors participating multiple times on equity crowdfunding campaigns. And if there's email marketing, any type of investor webinars, from the founder, from the team, to the completed investments, to the investor base, any type of messaging regularly to this audience, we see those numbers increase at the higher end of that range. So I'm always encouraging issuers to do that. It's great that you're able to point that out for your own campaign. I think some marketers, some of the portals think, an investment occurs and then, hey, now we want to market to different audiences. But like you mentioned, these individuals have taken an interest in many senses of the word into your organization. Rather than researching another company, even a competitor in the vertical, why not really take their passion for the vertical at this point and have a bigger position around it, potentially a stronger return around it over time is what an investor may be thinking. So, it's great that you're able to point that out.
Okay.
Excellent. So that's for scaling the equity crowdfunding campaign. Any other tips? I know you've been part of exits before. Any other wouldn't want you to share anything too forward-looking, but anything else that you could share towards scale, beyond the equity crowdfunding campaign, overall business growth for any listeners?
I'd say whether it's the equity crowdfunding or sort of money that you raise in addition to that through other sources, I have always found that it's very helpful to be very thoughtful and specific of why you take money from investors, and make sure that that money is very well spent. So instead of sort of taking it in and then sort of figuring it out, being very diligent about making sure that it's spent for the reasons that you took the money from originally tends to keep investors happy, and they return to you after the fact. Not everything will go according to plan. When things change, it's important to communicate and explain why you're making a different decision for that than what you originally said at that point. And again, investors are very smart people, and they appreciate that honesty and that candidness. And again, that's even though it didn't go the way they originally envisioned, the fact that you're candid and honest will come back and pay you back again down the line.
Communication is everything. It's a partnership with those individuals, and as you said, they're very smart. Speak to them accordingly. Balky, this information is very valuable. I get asked these questions daily from issuers, prospective groups, from the portals themselves. You part of the percentage that has done it successfully. So this is firsthand knowledge. I really appreciate you opening up here. Any final thoughts, any final notes, anything we didn't get to that you want to make sure to leave the audience with?
I'll just say that when we started the journey of crowdfunding, we didn't know if this would be a positive experience. We were a little wary of the process, for lack of a better word, but it turned out to be an incredibly positive experience, and we've gone back to it. As you know, we have a raise on Start Engine that's live right now. I welcome people to take a look at it if they're interested, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you reach out to me. So.
Excellent. And what is the best way to reach out to you? If anyone's listening in, whether they're a prospective investor or just a founder, maybe someone in the industry who has some questions after hearing you here, what's your preferred method of contact?
Look us up on our website, www.oscillapower.com, and use the contact tool in there, and we'll get it directly.
Very good. And I got to tell you, on behalf of my team, we're very excited to see where Ocelot Power is going in the future with your current campaign, with the organization as a whole. Most importantly, it's been an honor working with you through this process and seeing everything come to life. Again, revolutionary technology, excellent leadership team. So appreciate you being able to hop on today. Thank you for the time and being able to speak with the audience here.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, Balky. Thanks, everyone, for listening in. We'll make sure to see you on the next podcast, and encourage you to reach out to Balky, reach out to us with any questions as well, and have a good one.